That's a good question.
Oh, that's a good question.
That's a tough one. I guess the $1,000,000 question.
That's a great question.
Problems are all around us.
There's just so many questions.
There are so many questions out there and so little time to do the work.
You just to pick your the favorite problem.
You have to find something you love.
Have to be really excited about what you're choosing to work on.
Find the topic that you like to work on.
It's very important to work on problems that you're passionate about.
I have to be deeply interested.
Figure out what you really want to do.
What I find exciting.
Looking out into the world.
What's going on in the world.
A very random thing.
Reading groups have really helped me.
Interactions with other researchers.
Talks in conferences, talks in seminars.
Read a paper.
Or you took a class.
Sometimes I look for A and I find B.
If it's not happening to you now, don't panic.
Where I feel that I have to be deeply interested in the question. Like it should keep me thinking. It shouldn't be like work. It should be something which I really care about, and it's natural for me to think about it all the time. So I just try to keep up with the literature as much as I can, and I have my own set of favorite problems. Most of them I've had for many years and not solved.
That's a good question. I feel like I said recently that, like, to someone that, I'll work on anything that's interesting to me. I don't think that that's really like how I go about finding problems. So I have an agenda, I guess. It's sort of motivating a lot of the things that I work on. Trying to sort of work on the chip away in some very small way at the foundations of cryptography. I don't know. So yeah, what do I do? Yeah, I guess typically I'll try to start with something that is start with some dream theorem or something like this, and then okay, well, what if we make this relaxation and that relaxation and that relaxation? Okay, now it's trivial. Okay, now what if we step one step up? Is there something to do or something like this? This is, I guess, how I go about asking questions. Where does the big question come from? That's a good question. Obviously, so sometimes these things come from reading, I guess, but I feel like that's less true. Sometimes you find good questions by reading other papers, but I feel like I don't know, there's sort of foundational questions that come up when you're even doing undergraduate studies, and these are the ones that are really exciting. Of course, they're impossible, but so yeah, I don't know if that makes sense. I think it's important to read and stay current and stuff like this, but I think it's also important to not be too swept up in trends and stuff like this, and to really I don't know, it's exhausting, first of all, to read what everyone else is doing all the time.
Well, to meaningfully answer that requires us, I believe, to step back a bit and re-examine the question itself. The question suggests personal agency through the word I, which may be you, pick a problem. And I suggest that this agency is largely absent, that it's a myth. We may think we personally make a choice, that we have free will and exercise it in terms of choosing problems. Yet our choices are not our own. They're heavily conditioned by the surrounding culture and community of our field. This culture values and rewards certain things, certain choices, and researchers will largely and naturally gravitate to picking problems consistent with these values. Truly original choices of problems and directions are difficult and rare. As an example, theoretical cryptography has evolved a culture that places high value on basing cryptography on alternative or weaker computational assumptions. So when one considers what to do, it's natural and common to pick problems in that space. Another similar common theme is improving efficiency. And so we have lots of papers on topics like that. Or often people pick problems whose solution will bring recognition. It will lead to accepted papers. It will lead to nice things being said by reviewers. It will lead to praise from those considered to be leaders in the field and to jobs. There's nothing wrong with all of that, but as a result, often you only think that you make your own problem choices. In fact, others are determining what you pick. And this happens through the value that others are putting on the choices you make. Well, can we make fresh choices? To do so requires some understanding of what influences current ones. Yuval Harari, in his book *Sapiens*, writes that myth and stories were the greatest creation of the cognitive revolution, and he describes how our belief in them makes up the lives we live. Well, cryptography too has its stories. They're in the introductions of the papers you read, in what talks people give. These stories have often existed for decades, and they may tell you that some questions are important and others are not. So can you recognize them as stories, as a challenge, question them, see the gaps and assumptions implicit in them, and consider looking at things differently, asking if they are true, moving beyond? I encourage you to try things like that. Now, the question I was asked was how I personally pick problems. And I've not really addressed that so far for two reasons. First, I see the general context of problem picking and the forces that influence it, as discussed above, as much more important than my personal choices. Second, my own choices are not better than or more original than those of others. While I try to be aware in making them of the types of issues I've outlined above, I am in the end, of course, just as subject as anyone to the influence of the stories and the culture that exists. So with that said, if you're still interested in my personal choices, well, I often look to practice. I try to see what cryptographic problems arise in practice, and then step back to create theory around it. I find that the perspective of people outside our field brings freshness. Practitioners and people in industry bring up many interesting issues, angles, and questions, and these form the basis for fresh new research problems. Also, news, blogs, what's going on in the world can inspire new directions for research too. I like definitions. Often I center a piece of work around a new definition or an attempt to define something differently, and I ask how to formalize things or create definitions to model real-world problems. I think we as a field could do more to ask ourselves about the social value and impact of our work. In my earlier career, I sought to do things that are practical, and at that point I defined practical as someone is using this. I've since come to ask beyond that question, who benefits from this? Right now we live in a world where forces that are powerful yet not clearly visible gather data about us and use it to influence our behavior. Sometimes the tools we build as cryptographers are extending rather than diminishing the manipulative power and effort of these entities. Can we examine cryptographic tools and applications in this light, determining whether the social impact is positive or negative? Can we have more of what Seni Kamara calls crypto for the people?
In some sense, you just pick your the favorite problem you work on and be interested in it.
Oh, that's also a very random thing. And maybe also depend on my personal style. So I think there are two factors, or two dimensions. One dimension is, of course, I still have my own test on the research topic. So somehow I like content-related research topics, and that's kind of a long-term interest. Maybe since my undergraduate. So I was in the CS major, but then I tried to take content-related course in physics department, and then also in PhD, I try to take courses on quantum complexity theory, and also when I do in crypto, I talk to people doing quantum research on possible collaborations. So that gradually kind of helped me to move to more and more focus on quantum cryptography. On the other hand, I think my own style maybe coming a lot from my postdoc advisor, Rafael Paz, is that I think research is much more enjoyable and more maybe fun and efficient when we have a good collaborator to discuss. So I would also try to optimize or seize the opportunity when there's a chance. So if there's some conversation or some visitors come and lead to some discussion, maybe not in my close area, I usually would kind of very willing to kind of give it a try and then collaborate with people on different topics that I don't usually working on myself. Yeah, so maybe as a interesting example, because of COVID, so some of the Taiwanese PhD students in the US come back to Taiwan to kind of escape from the pandemic. Yeah, and some of them have like they are doing PhD in the physics department, but also have some CS related research experience. They also publish in like QIP, and they have more expertise in the physics side, and also they are quite good, and so we start to collaborate on topics that's kind of motivate from recent theory development in black hole and its connection to computer science, and that a fun project come out from there.
I guess these days I find research problems often just by reading the newspaper. So every morning I look at the news, and typically there's at least one or two, if not 3 or 4 stories about computer security or cryptography or privacy. And for me, this is a great source of research problems, because often there's a social problem, and then if, most of the time I have nothing to say about it. I mean, it's a hard problem, but I don't know how to solve it. And then sometimes you see a problem and you think, oh, maybe I could use this tool from here or this tool from here and come up with a solution. So I guess for me, one of the best source of research problems is kind of looking out into the world and seeing what's going on with computer security and crypto, and then trying to understand what we as researchers can do to say something about those problems.
So good. How to find a topic to work on? I mean, for me, this grew. Some topics grew on me over time, but I think most of the times new and exciting research directions come out of interactions with other researchers. This is my most. I mean, this happened for most cool things that I think was working on. They came out of some unexpected segue that some discussion or interaction took. You're all of a sudden on a track for something, and then you just keep going. So it's really the people around you who shape what your way your research goes. It's not like you're going on the ePrint server, look what seems to be a cool topic right now and try to get into that business. I could imagine that's pretty hard, but it needs to grow, right? And to plant the seeds for these trees, it's really helpful to interact with a lot of people, to get good relationships, to good collaborative relationships with other researchers from the field. So
so I basically try to look at what other people have been working on, and among those things, I try to ascertain what I find exciting, where do I think the community is headed, things that would excite people and enhance our understanding of crypto. So that sort of is a way to how I think of problems.
Well, that's a tough one. I guess the million-dollar question. There are no universal rules. A lot of my research comes out naturally from previous research, but my general criterion for preferring some research questions over others is succinctness. If a question can be described succinctly so that you can tell about it to a colleague working in a different area without having to give a lot of background, and keep in mind that to us things that are simple are not always simple to others. So if it can also be decoded correctly by the other side, then this is a big plus from my point of view.
I think this is two questions. So one question is how to find a research question, research topic in general. And the second one is how to decide which research problem actually to focus on. And for the first part, I think I never even actually actively looked to find a research topic to work on, because there's just so many questions floating around. There's research questions that come up in discussion with others or are actively posed by others. There is open questions given in talks, given in research papers. There is the questions that you think of when you listen to a talk or when you read a research paper. Why is the model like this? Couldn't we use this technique to improve this? Or could we use this technique to make progress on another problem? So more indirect way to find research problems. And then, of course, the second part, which one do you actually follow up on? And for me, I think this is two parts. It's like how interesting I find the problem from a more like technical point of view, how much I'm intrigued to solve the question, and also how relevant do I think the question is, because I like to work on questions where I think they do have some impact or implications, like either theoretical or practical, but they're not just pure problems in that sense.
Just the lazy way, which is just what's the next step of your previous project, or things that you left open but you feel that that can be done, or things like that. That's usually the natural next steps. Another source of many research projects are talks in conferences, talks in seminars, and so on. You either find the question interesting or something in the technical part of the talk seems as if it can be useful for some questions that you are interested in. So that's a different source. And maybe a last source that is actually very useful is when you write grants, because when you write grants, you are usually required to come up with something that will look novel and, not just the next step of your previous paper, but something which is more, new, and maybe that you can ask few questions about it. So thinking about the grants that we write, usually, it's a lot of work and so on. And we think about this maybe as something that's a bit annoying, but it has a lot of positive side effects on, creating new research questions and so on. Yeah, and of course, often from, ideas that come from my students and so on.
Well, I mean, these days it's more like, how do I find the time to do the research? There are so many questions out there and so little time to do the work. But at first, as a student, probably the best way to go at finding a question to work on is to ask your advisor and see what problems they have, and then give a try to work on them. So there are a lot of things that go into getting a good question. It's not just about the problem, it's about whether there is an audience or there are people interested in that question, and all things that can be harder to evaluate before you have more experience in the area. And of course, you're always welcome to come up with your own questions. And if you can come up not only with a question but also with the answer, so that's great. But yeah, so typically coming up with questions and then asking the questions to your advisor and see if they can solve the problem. Usually, that's not a good strategy.
Depends a lot on your experience. Once you have a lot of experience and you worked on a topic that you like, it's kind of natural to start thinking of open problems in this area. And I think what is very important is to try to do that at an early stage in your career. In particular, I think it's very important for a PhD advisor to let the student brainstorm about ideas and also think by himself on the topics that he would like to work on. This is also something that I did during my PhD. And at the beginning, I kind of hated it. Really, to be honest, I didn't like that. But then in the long run, I realized that that was very beneficial for me because it helped me think about the projects that I like. And also drive my agenda and think on the next problems. So I think it's very important to first find the topic that you like to work on. And once you start working on this area, you will see that you will start getting more ideas.
I think this goes back also to what I said about starting research projects. You have to be really excited about what you're choosing to work on. Depending how far you are in your career, maybe you already have worked in a certain area for a long time and you have good knowledge about what are the open questions and how promising or how exciting they are for you. So maybe you want to build your research record in this direction that you have already had significant impact. And in that sense, you have advantage in working and knowing how to solve the problems. But oftentimes, maybe you are motivated by specific applications that you want to solve, and you need to do the translation between the needs of this application and what kind of cryptographic tools you would need. So when you are approaching the problem from this direction, you really are defining what you're trying to solve, and then you start learning about the area if you don't know, and start finding a way to achieve what you're trying to have as a result.
So finding research problems is one of the things you learn over time. That's why you have an advisor. If there's something that advisors help with at the beginning is with finding it, and also it's beyond just finding the problems. Problems are all around us. Is kind of determining what kind of problems we like, what's our taste like, what are our abilities like. I mean, some people can work well on some kind of problems and others on other kind of problems. So for me, I have this bunch of problems that I've been going with for many years, and from time to time I revisit. And then I have problems that I am exposed to because I heard a talk that made me think, or looked at a paper or something like this. And there are other areas in which I work where I kind of from scratch, like try to think about what are good problems, what should be done. So for now, for example, I work in algorithmic fairness, which is a younger field, and I feel that choosing what to work on is very important because it kind of sets where the field is going. I usually am not very calculated in that. I just go with it, and then things work. I did know I am teaching now a class on research methods, and I've seen that you can also be very, very calculated, read a paper, think. So I'm working with my class on because I have very short time that people need to do some research in. I developed a method that, I mean, it's not unique to other people, but I see that it just works. So you read a recent paper, you think what's there to improve, you look at other papers and that seem related, etc. So you can do things in a very kind of calculated way and read papers and try to understand them very well. And every paper has something that kind of pushes you further. It doesn't always, it's not always the way I work, but sometimes it's a good way to work with students. Good. My first research problem was a very big question that my advisor asked me, and it did work. And big questions are often ways in which you hear a big question, and then you read things towards answering this question, and eventually you may answer something else. In fact, I do believe that we should be very ambitious. So I don't think that we should do very small things. The question is, where does our inspiration come from? It can come from a well-known problem. It can come from a recent paper we read, from a talk, or it can be internal to us. We can say, oh, this is something important that needs to be solved. And again, here, like in any other place, everybody's different. And I think that what we should learn is how we work well. And we should acknowledge that it is fine. Whatever works for us is fine. But I do feel that for a short time project with a student, it's not something I did in the past, but I think perhaps it's a good way to give them a paper, to have them read it, explain it, and then discuss what are the next steps.
I want to give kind of two answers to that. I think the first is the most important one, which is just that you have to find something you love, right? Like research is really hard. And if you don't find a topic that you actually love, then you won't have the energy to deal with all the setbacks, right? There's so many setbacks in research. So I think that's by far the most important thing. And then for me personally, this is different for everyone, right? But for me personally, the thing about cryptography in particular, the thing about cryptography that has always captured my imagination is how close we get to the edge, right? We always come right to the edge between the impossible and the possible, right? So for me, that's what really makes me excited, is trying to understand where is that line? When do we have things that are impossible and when do we have things that are possible? So sort of mapping out that boundary between the possible and the impossible, to me, that just makes me really excited and just captures my imagination. So I love working on problems like that.
I remember that at the beginning of my PhD, so when you start, then, well, either your supervisor gives you a topic, and I try to do this with my students, right? I give them one topic where I feel like this is a nice contained project that should give a paper, and a nice first experience, and then you work on this project. And so I can say a little bit more about like how my PhD started, but at some point I was on that track that basically I had maybe at some point two projects that I worked on, and that was nice and contained. And then when going to conference and talking to people and presenting your results, you get ideas and more ideas. And then at some point towards the end of my PhD, there was this switch where I realized like I can't do everything that I find interesting to work on. There's like suddenly all these different ideas that would be cool to do. And I think as well as a PhD student, I think before, whenever there was something super cool and interesting and somebody wanted to work with you on it, you said yes. And then yes, at some point the switch where if you say yes to everything, you realize you have too much on your plate. And then I think you need to learn how to say no and figure out what you really want to do. What I then actually found occasionally helpful is something that we all do and nobody really loves to do, and that is maybe writing project proposals. So when you're writing proposals, it's like, I don't like to do this excessively, but every few years, just writing down what you want to do in the next few years to basically refocus and think, okay, so what is actually the big goal that I want to accomplish? What are the nice steps for this? And well, formulate a few tasks that you want to do. And of course, this isn't written in stone. You can still change this over time and new ideas come up. But this is maybe helpful to refocus a little bit how to select topics once there are too many.
Oh, that's a good question. So really, there's three methodologies. So the first one I use is actually people contact you with problems that they've got to solve, or there's some company emails you and says, how do we solve this? And this kind of leads you don't know how to do it, so this kind of leads into new research. So that's kind of like external, like problem pull kind of things. And then there's, because you're kind of as old as I am, lots of people like contact you via email saying, I'm stuck in this paper, how do I solve this bit? Or you might know how to solve this. So that's kind of a bit more reactive when just people email you. And then the third thing, and probably the most, for my kind of research, is the one that's most successful, is you actually try and implement something. So a lot of my papers have been, someone did something theoretical and you then go, I wonder how practical this is. So you try and implement it. And then you find there's problems, and then you kind of try and solve those problems. So for example, we had, when we did the first large-scale actively secure computation with Yao, no one had even thought about you could do Yao actively secure and implement it. So we tried it and we found lots of improvements that, started the whole kind of garbled circuit in practice kind of world. And then like in the early days of FHE, Gentry's thesis came out, and just to try and understand Gentry's thesis, we tried to implement it, and we found lots of improvements and lots of ways of improving things and so on. So that's kind of the three methodologies I use.
Yeah, that's a great question. I would say I rarely start out with a particular question that I want to answer and then actually answer it. That happens much less frequently than the other case where I start out with something one question that leads to another question that leads to another question, and then eventually we answer some question down the line that's related to it, but turns out to be really cool. So for me, I would say finding a project is often about just starting somewhere. You read a paper, you start up, you have an idea about something that might be some way to improve it, or you start up with a question that maybe that seems like a really, maybe even a big one of the big really hard questions in the field, but try to modify it in some way that might make it more approachable. And often, you start with something, you realize it's not a very good question, you modify it a few ways, but it leads to something interesting down the line. So I guess my best advice on that front is just to be very flexible with what the goal is. It's okay if it's a moving post, if it changes during the research project. Our whole area is about exploring and trying to find interesting things. If you want to explore, it's important to be flexible and not set your sights on just one specific thing and nothing other than that. And one thing along those lines I would say is be very conscious of connections. So even if you start with something don't have a small idea for what to solve one particular problem, try to think of ways that could connect to other questions, maybe even the bigger questions in the area. And sometimes when you develop a new tool, you find that it is useful and that it has all surprising connections beyond what you initially started with.
Reading groups have really helped me when looking for new problems. These kinds of groups are a great low-pressure social setting for studying and discussing recent papers, and they're often interesting open problems that come to light. Another thing I like to do when I'm looking for new problems is to make tables that describe the properties of existing tools within a certain space. These tables make it easy to spot where there are gaps in the existing primitives and where there are opportunities for new research. And I think this kind of thing works particularly well for tools with a lot of trade-offs, like secure multi-party computation.
Oh, I have many ways of finding research topics. One way is to have a very long-term interest in something, in an area, and then you just explore around it. So for me, there are a few sub-areas that I'm constantly interested in. And let's say I've been exploring for 25 years or 20 years. And then I have some open problems there, and the technology moves, and maybe there is something to do new in the area. Well, I can give an example, like threshold cryptography has been an interest of mine. And I wanted also always to have very nice properties. And then, there was pairing. Suddenly people explored pairing and various pairings and new algebra. Is there a way to use it to do new things and other ways that came along? A few times I tried to solve some problems as basic encryption and signature methods change. And I have my own interest, and similarly in malicious cryptography, using crypto for attacking crypto and things like this. So I'm always looking for reasons to work on it, to find attacks, to find preventive methods, and even to apply it to other areas. So I'm always returning to it. Second source of problems is just the interest of the community. Obviously, that's like everyone. Somebody has good idea, maybe there are better ideas how to improve it and things like this. And that's always good, and this is also a way to keep up with the field. A third way is to understand what industry wants and needs and what the market wants and needs. Because I am also a researcher in industry, I do it, but you don't have to. You can do guessing from academia too. Of course, you may be less targeted, but you can be motivated by affecting reality and things like. So I think a combination of interests, long-term interests, coming needs and importance, and new interest in the community that can affect you, but it has to affect you in a way that it kind of it's in the same wavelength as your research. Not because everybody is doing something, it doesn't mean you have to. It's not. You should not be just opportunistic. You should have an implicit research plan, and it has to be suitable for it in some sense. And then things comes naturally. And also sometimes I look for A and I find B. These things can happen. Things to say about that. One thing to say is sometimes opening your eyes and looking around you brings forward research problems. Just kind of looking at the world and thinking of what's missing brings forward research problems. And I think a lot of kind of research agendas started in this way.
Another thing, which is I feel like has been worked well with students that I've worked with, and also for myself, is it's very important to work on problems that you're passionate about. So, in my opinion, what distinguishes, people who have great work and people who have kind of mediocre work is not kind of how smart, whatever that means, they are, but how excited they are. And kind of when you're excited and kind of caught up, kind of caught on something, you can't sleep at night. That's when I think progress happens. So I think it's very important to kind of think with yourself, when you wake up in the morning, you stare at the piece of paper, what do you want to think about? Like, where does your mind take you? And go with that. So, I mean, I'm saying a little bit, not contradictory, but very different things. On the one hand, look what people are looking for, look what the world is looking for, and you'll see a lot of questions out there to work on. But then which one to choose or which direction to go, it needs to come from your heart, not from whatever, your advisor tells you or, what your friend does, or it needs to come really from within. Otherwise, I think that increases the chances of solving it.
So, Yael, I have a comment, just an answer to Tal, but also a question to you afterwards. So my comment is how I find research problems sometimes, it's kind of a combination of the two things Yael said maybe, is when you read a paper, if it's a paper I'm interested in, I don't just read it, but I stop and think, what would I do? Or I read the first line in the introduction, I think, oh, wait, so what is the question here? And what would I do? And then they often do something else, or they phrase the questions differently. And then I think about it deeply, like, why is the way I thought about it not make sense, not interesting, too difficult? And somehow when you think like this, but this is only possible if you're actually interested in the paper, then questions come up like, yeah, I have a different way to think about it, or somehow this is the right way to do things, or there's a clear gap, not a gap that the authors write at the end, open problems, but somehow just how would I go about it? And then even if there's no research problem that comes out from it, I understand better the paper and get more out of it. But Yael, I have a question to what you said. Let's say somebody is not excited, who wakes up in the morning and doesn't want to look at the paper. Like, how do you become excited, like think about it in the shower, can't sleep at night? I ask you because a student asked me that recently. And not just Yael, I wonder what you all would say about that. Like, is it just happened to you, or did you develop it in some way?
I feel like sometimes you get excited, not just by the problem itself, you get excited by the setting. So, I think excitement is very helpful. Okay, I think it brings out a lot of good, but you can be excited, just because you're in a vacuum with your own research problem and that's what excites you. You can be excited because you're working with your advisor and you want to impress them. You can be excited because you're working with a fellow student that you want to impress. You can be just excited because you're working with people that, like, the group has some excitement, and kind of it's so sometimes you need to kind of put yourself, and it's not just the problem itself, it's which community you're in. You need to think how to maneuver in a way that you find a place that's really good for you. And I think science is not the only factor here. I think human factor is also a very big factor. I have to say, for me, a lot of my motivation comes from, I want to, especially if I work with students, I want them to succeed. I work a lot because I'm dying to make it to the deadline, because I want them to have the paper ready for their deadline. So I think it's a setup as well helps with that.
Actually, if I can jump in, a couple of things. First of all, this interaction with people, for me, it's tremendous. I really realized this during COVID, when we weren't having meetings and stuff. It was much harder for me to get excited about things, and I think I didn't even really realize this. But the combination of talking and bouncing ideas back and forth and joking around with people and wanting to solve these things really does kind of direct the path. So, for example, I'm also, I think everybody in some sense is also kind of affected by the collaborators that they have. You kind of go in different directions. Right. Another thing, which is not an answer to any of these questions, but sort of fits in here, is that so choosing research problems, it's something that when I was a student, it just it seemed very hard for me. How do you choose something? How do you know what seems interesting or plausible for solving? And I don't really know what happened, and unfortunately, it's not a very good answer. But I think, in some sense, it just naturally, once you see this process multiple times, and you start becoming more of the expert in some area, it becomes very natural. Like you see a paper and you think, oh wow, I want to solve these things. So maybe just one thing at least to say is that if it's not happening to you now, don't panic. That it's something that sort of all of a sudden just happens without realizing it. That you start getting through this process.
So the question you asked is, how do you write a good research paper? And I want to say that there are many types of research papers. So there's not one good type, and there's many type of research problems if we go one step further. So to give you two different examples, one example is, let's say you are in some field that hasn't even started, where there is no prior papers to read in order to understand what you want to improve. But so where does that start from? Obviously, it doesn't start from a vacuum. I mean, everything starts from something. So it could be that you've heard a lecture that had some inspiring result that was described, or you took a class which had a grain of an inkling of an idea that the example that came to my mind was this example of Lewis transfer that actually Tal Rabin is responsible for, where it's a mechanism which really, if you think about it, it's very unusual and makes little sense, where you can sort of transfer a bit from one party to another without knowing which bit came across, whether it's a 0 or 1. And it turns out that this primitive is extremely important for cryptographic protocols. But why he thought about it originally? Was it to solve a specific problem? Was it just an interesting, curious mechanism of transfer of information? So that's an example of a problem that seems like a toy problem. Another example is tossing a coin over a telephone. Again, it's an example of a toy problem, which doesn't necessarily have an application. It's not that someone asked it before. It's not that you're improving a previous solution, but in our field at least, it's a real world phenomenon. It's something that we know from the physical world that we're trying to implement using mathematics or emulate it using mathematics. This is one type of problem, which, probably these days, maybe in machine learning, these are the type of problems that people are thinking of. If we think about GANs or something, trying to generate data or generate data similar to data that you see in nature. But another type of problem, which comes up a lot in theoretical computer science, would be where things have been defined already, but you want to improve the parameters of the problem. And when I say parameters, I don't mean it in a bad way, I mean in a good way. So let's say a approximation hardness parameter, or maybe the size of a proof, versus the number of queries that you make to the proof and so forth. And that's a much more classical maybe way of defining a problem. And that would lead it to a very different kind of paper. So when you say what makes a good research paper, how do you write a good research paper, depends which type, which bucket you fall in. You write the paper also very differently, I would think. And I think that's all I said.
I have something to say about Shafi's thing, because I actually wanted to say another way to do research, but then thought it's really Shafi's way, so I can't say anything. I'll wait for her to speak. And you touched upon it, but I want to emphasize it more. So I remember when I was, not actually throughout my career, not just as a student, but every time I sit with you, Shafi, in a talk, we finish the talk and Shafi has about 1,000 open problems. Why do you do that? Let's try to do that. Why did they do this model? This is the wrong model. You tried this model. So I guess my point is, it relates to what Tal said, whether you're reading a paper or you're going to a talk or you're going to a lecture, if you think critically, you'll see that there's a lot of open problems there that are very interesting. Like, why is that the right choice of model? Just think, is this definition, is it the right one? Maybe it doesn't capture something. Or just really critical thinking really opens up a lot of open problems.